Hello, everyone, and welcome to Kumi Now. Thank you for joining us for this latest online gathering as we talk about anti-Semitism around the world. We are glad that you were able to join us at the right time this week. We know it gets complicated with the time changes happening on different days in different countries, so we're happy you're with us. My name is Sarah Brubaker, and I'm happy to serve as your host this week. I'm joining you from Lincoln, Nebraska, where I am a settler on the traditional territory of the Oto, Missouri, and Pawnee. Before we go further, I'd like to remind you that our webinar is being broadcast live on Facebook and will be posted to YouTube. So if you want to make sure your photo does not accidentally appear online, please turn off your camera. And we would love it if you could quickly share one of the links that's being posted in the chat so that others can still join us today. As usual, if you have an idea for a project you'd like to share, feel free to reach out, emailing us at kumi@kuminow.com. We'll go ahead and start with introducing our speakers for today. So Omar and Father David Neuhaus, please introduce yourselves.
Thank you, Sarah. My name is Omar Harami. I am part of Sabil, Jerusalem. I will be giving a very short update from the ground on what is happening in Palestine and Israel in the past week. It's a pleasure to be with you again and to be with Father David.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Omar. I'm also very happy to be with you all. I am David Neuhaus. I am an Israeli Jesuit priest in the Holy Land since 1977, and I'll be sharing with you some thoughts on anti-Semitism tonight.
Thank you so much, both of you. So we'll go ahead and Omar will be giving us an update of what is happening on the ground in Palestine this week.
Thank you, Sarah. We are still, 6 Palestinian prisoners are still going on in their hunger strike, protesting administrative detention. Maqdad al-Qawasmi has been for 120 days in a hunger strike. So this is his picture before and after the hunger strike. So please remember all Palestinian prisoners, especially the ones who are doing the hunger strike in your prayers. Today, a group of Palestinian prisoners also in solidarity joined the Palestinian prisoners who are conducting the hunger strike. We have Murad Atiyeh. He is from Sheikh Jarrah families. He is the one, he is the person who would always welcome visitors who would come and to show solidarity with Sheikh Jarrah. He was arrested 4 months ago. Israel has not charged him. He is himself being arrested under administrative detention. His sister's marriage was yesterday. The lawyer has been always appealing. He's saying, at least let him, since you haven't charged him, at least have him attend his sister's wedding. And Israel was blackmailing him, saying that you will stop your activism in Sheikh Jarrah, and etc. So they were using his sister as, and the wedding of his sister and this important family occasion to blackmail him and to challenge him. And in a way to resist Israeli blackmail, the wedding took place today. There is a very famous newspaper magazine. It's called The Marker, and they tried to identify 40 successful young people in the world. And in their latest edition, they assigned 4 Palestinians from inside Israel as one of the top 40 leading promising figures in the world. Among them is Haytham, who has done a number of studies on autism and Alzheimer, and people who are in IT, in accounting, professors, people who are in different fields. So it's a very promising, it's a good It's a good news. We usually not mention good news at Sabil, unfortunately, in this update. But something very promising for our young people that we are also capable to perform like the rest of the people in the world. This week was very sad. Yesterday, two people that we know personally at Sabil passed away. Alber Mirab is a Palestinian musician from inside Israel, from Rami. He's a known musician for his songs that are very much within the Palestinian culture, and would always be active in the in activism and in resisting Israeli policies. Sabil partnered with him in a number of plays and acts and events. He passed away because of cancer. And suddenly also Emil Shamma, who is a friend of mine and a friend of Sabil, and a very active person within the Greek Orthodox Palestinian community. He's known to be always making a stand against the land sales within the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate. They both passed away yesterday in shocking news and very sad news for us as Palestinians. So please remember their families in your prayers. Today, Israel also commemorates the 83rd anniversary of the beginning of the anti-Jewish pogrom that was labeled or known the Night of Broken Glass, when Nazis, with many Germans and people from Austria, started to attack and break the windows of Jews around the world. Unfortunately, according to a study, anti-Semitism has grown in the past year, especially in Europe, with attacking the Jewish communities or Jewish buildings, synagogues. So this is why we will have our session, and Father David will be sharing with us more details. Today, also for the people, for many of our friends who know Bethlehem and know Al-Walaji, 3 Palestinian homes were demolished by the Israeli army. The reason was given that they were built without building permits. Israel this week has demolished over 25 structures, many of them in the South Hebron Hills, but also in Bethlehem and in the Selfit area. Attacks on Palestinians continue to increase, unfortunately, from settler young people. So today in Al-Bire, which is adjacent or part of Ramallah, Israeli settlers went into Al-Bire and used spray paint to write hate words and hate slogans on Palestinian cars, houses, and people's doors and windows. Earlier also this week, Israeli settlers would gather around, especially in the north, in the area of the north of the West Bank, throwing stones at Palestinian cars. Close to Ramallah, many families were, many Palestinian cars were hit, which continues to create panic in many of our Palestinian villages. In Taqwa, close in the south of the West Bank, close to Bethlehem. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it is the place where Prophet Amos comes from. Father David might correct me, as he is a specialist. Palestinian farmers have been under attack by settlers while they were picking up their olives. A diplomat from the South African embassy decided to come and help them. The Israeli army yesterday denied him access to and forced him to stop helping the families and asked him to leave the premises. That is unfortunate. Actually, also in Susia, I don't have a picture or a slide here. Israeli settlers attacked a playground for children. We have actually a friend of ours who was in Susia at the time. They were trying to demolish the playground, which was recently built, but fortunately the community stopped them. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. It's always so important to hear, what's going on. So much happens in 1 week. Before we go to our presentation for today, we will try again to do our poll. So if someone wants to try to launch the survey poll. Here we go. So again, remember to scroll down so you can see all 3 questions. First question, what actions did you take related to the last topic, anti-Muslim and anti-Islamic discrimination? And question number 2, major annual violent incidences of some anti-Semitism worldwide did what from 1989 to 2019? Declined, stayed the same, increased slightly, or increased significantly? And the last question, in 2020, the COVID pandemic seemed to do what to incidents of anti-Semitism? Reduced all types of anti-Semitic acts, reduced violent acts, but increased acts of online anti-Semitism, increased violent acts, but decreased online anti-Semitism, or it didn't change trends in anti-Semitism. All right, just another few seconds. And so the answer to number 2, major annual violent incidences of anti-Semitism worldwide did what from 1989 to 2019? And they increased significantly. From 78 attacks recorded worldwide in 1989 to 456 attacks in 2019. And the answer to number 3 about the COVID pandemic is the second answer, that violent acts were reduced, but online anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic vandalism increased. So the lockdowns seemed to reduce the number of in-person interactions between Jews and potential attackers in 2020. However, empty streets and museums and other buildings led to more incidences of vandalism and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories blaming Jews for creating or spreading the virus-fueled online anti-Semitism. So very important for us to be aware of these trends. And we will now turn to our main event and to our special guest, Father David. And if anyone thinks of a question while he's speaking, just be sure to type it in the chat and we'll ask as many as possible when we get to the question and answer period. So thank you, Father David. Please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you, Sarah. I think it might be helpful if during my presentation I share a screen, PowerPoint screen, which is what I'm going to do. I'm hoping that now you can all see what I'm seeing. It should actually not be here, it should be in the beginning. That's the beginning. So good evening, everybody, once again. I'm very happy to share with you. I'm hoping to lead you not through a survey of anti-Semitism in the world today, but rather something a little bit more conceptual. So I will start with the first point, saying that we, as people who are supporters of Sabeel and concerned about the Palestinian people, will focus on 2 aspects of anti-Semitism. First, and as was already shown through some of the pictures that Omar shared, today being the commemoration of Kristallnacht, and also the poll that was just done, we realize and we admit that anti-Semitism in the world, meaning irrational hatred of Jews, is a catastrophic reality for Jews everywhere. But what we are also very concerned about is the catastrophic consequences of anti-Semitism for Palestinians. And here, when I say anti-Semitism, I'm using it still in its very strict sense, and that is a hatred of Jews and how that has affected the fate of the Palestinian people. And I think that tonight we want to hold those two things together. I think that too often those who are very aware of anti-Semitism are ignoring or even denying the catastrophic consequences for Palestinians, and those who are very concerned about Palestinians might not realize how real and catastrophic anti-Semitism is in the Jewish reality. I want to also point out that anti-Semitism has a precursor that goes back many, many centuries, and I'm going to refer to that as anti-Judaism, distinguishing it from anti-Semitism, a distinction that should become clear as we move through this very short presentation. So we can identify a certain anti-Judaism that has nothing to do with Christianity, that is pre-Christian, that exists in the Muslim world and other places. But I think that what we need to be particularly concerned about, because most of us are Christians, is Christian theological anti-Semitism and, anti-Judaism, an anti-Judaism that is linked very, very closely to the development of Christianity. We all know that Christianity began as a Jewish movement. Jesus is Jewish, his disciples are Jewish, and the early church is Jewish. But as the Christian community became less and less Jewish, and we're talking about something that began at the end of the 1st century into the 2nd century and onwards, we find an increasing anti-Judaism, meaning an interpretation of the biblical texts, both Old and New Testaments, in a light that is anti-Jewish. We call that the teaching of contempt for Jews, which is based on a number of principles. First of all, blaming the Jewish people for the crucifixion of Jesus, for his death, of course, forgetting that Jesus himself is Jewish and those who believe in him were Jewish. And then, and perhaps even more importantly, the continuing refusal to accept Jesus as the Messiah, as the Son of God, as the Redeemer of all. And that will become a practice of contempt as Jews are spoken about in terms that do not befit Christian discourse. This will lead through the centuries, and particularly after the 4th century, when Christianity becomes a state religion, to exclusion and segregation, the social consequences of anti-Judaism, where Jews are excluded and segregated. This, of course, takes centuries to develop, but we already find the roots of this in legal codes within the empire that is now identified with the Christian religion, excluding Jews from certain positions, forbidding a certain degree of interaction between Jews and Christians, for example, intermarriage, forbidding conversion to Judaism and Jews who have been forced to convert to Christianity to return to the Jewish community. Synagogues cannot be repaired and sometimes cannot even be built. And this goes on and on and on into the Middle Ages, where we also have, and this began right from the beginning, but more and more, a degree of violence directed at the Jewish community and persecution of Jews as Jews. There are certain key moments that are carved into Jewish memory. For example, the Crusades, the Inquisition, and other examples of violence against the Jews. So this is an anti-Judaism distinguished from anti-Semitism because its roots are religious in a certain theological discourse. That's point number one. And point number two, to a certain degree, Jews can escape from this by converting to Christianity. So what we want to now discuss is modern anti-Semitism, which to a certain extent is a continuity of that ancient anti-Judaism. We move into the modern period, of course, with the Enlightenment, with the French Revolution, with the challenges of modernity, which include the separation of church and state. And many Jews, particularly in European countries like France, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and elsewhere, dream of integration. They dream of an ending of their status as outsiders imposed upon them by a theological discourse, and many, many Jews dream of becoming equal citizens in a country in which there is a separation between religion and state. And many Jews choose the path of integration. But unfortunately, the 19th century, which sees the rise of modern nationalism, very concerned once again with borders, and linked at least some trends in nationalism to the development of modern racism, brings about a new way of excluding Jews. And of course, this is intimately connected with the development of racist ideology, now no longer a religious theological discourse, at least not principally religious and theological. It becomes almost biological as we start to talk about blood, pure blood, or genes and genetics. Interesting to note that the whole concept of pure blood was introduced already very early on in the 15th century during the Spanish Inquisition as a way of excluding Jews. And I will add immediately, as we will be talking about that later, also a way of excluding Muslims. So the choice becomes between a nationalism that promotes integration of all those living within the borders of a national state, or an ethnocentric nationalism that focuses on exclusion, where difference, any kind of difference, is seen as a danger, and there is a search for some kind of uniformity. Once again, it's important to recognize that in the 19th century, many Jews sought total inclusion and gave up their difference. But of course, once we have a discourse that is based upon biological terminology of blood and genes, even they will not ultimately be safe. And so there is those groups within Europe, Jews, and I will insist, also people who are not Jewish, but see this racism, this anti-Semitism as a threat to general society, choosing to protest it, to fight against it. But of course, also many Jews will migrate at this time, sometimes facing the despondency of not seeing a way out other than leaving the country in which they live in order to escape this threat of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism will reach a peak in the 20th century. Again, it's almost mysterious that as we move through modernity, these demons of racism, anti-Semitism, and exclusion continue to haunt us. A regime will rise up in Germany. January 1933, Hitler will win democratic elections and use democracy in order to crush anybody who does not agree with him. And the Nazi madness will be focused upon the Jews as the ultimate enemy. This will lead to the attempt to get the Jews to leave. And when that fails, not only because countries will not accept Jews, but also because the Nazi empire will conquer the countries around and find themselves in control of more and more Jews and sense the urgency of getting rid of them, this will lead to the final solution and the genocide of 6 million Jews, referred to as the Shoah or the Holocaust. I add that this will finally, and it's so sad that it took this to finally lead many Christians to wake up to the foul roots of anti-Judaism within Christian theology, the totally misplaced theology of believing that God is angry with the Jews, punishing them in history through these acts of violence. And this will lead to a rethinking of theological categories that will allow us to engage in a dialogue with the Jewish people today in order that we can get beyond this kind of thinking. I want to now come to, because I presume that everything that I've already said is already very well thought out and established in most of those that are listening tonight to this talk. I want to now come to something that is very sensitive, but very necessary, I think, in our work as we struggle for justice in Israel-Palestine, and that is how to conjugate together anti-Semitism and Palestine. Again, point A, Shoah and Nakba can sound almost as a provocation. And of course, there is no intention to compare these catastrophes, but rather to link them with an and, because we recognize that historically they are intimately linked together. The Shoah, which ended in 1945, leads to a Nakba in 1948 that has not yet ended. And again, with no comparison intended here, I think it's very important to understand that because of worldwide anti-Semitism, and particularly within a world that is defined sometimes as Christian, but that in its anti-Semitism cannot be Christian, the roots were laid for the Palestinian tragedy. So I want to say that point number B, anti-Semitism is intimately linked with Zionism. This does not mean that I am arguing with those who say that the Jews always had an attachment to the land of Israel, a religious attachment, a messianic attachment, an eschatological attachment, a dream of at some time coming back to what Jews refer to as home. But political Zionism, in a very large and important degree, fed off anti-Semitism. Somebody like Herzl, who was not particularly religious, woke up to the terrible scourge of Zionism in his town of Vienna, where the mayor was one of the founders of modern anti-Semitism. And surely and certainly he moved towards proposing the only solution to the problem of anti-Semitism was for Jews to leave behind Europe, to migrate, and for him to a land that seemed linked to the Jewish people, meaning Palestine. So again, anti-Semitism I see as one of the foundations of modern Zionism, and we need to think seriously about how to think through Zionism and its roots in anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is also countered by many with a philo-Semitism that seems to be an interpretation of the Bible, whereas anti-Judaism proclaimed the anger of God against a deicide people blind to Jesus's messianic identity. A biblical philo-Semitism announces that the Jews are the chosen people of God to whom God has given the land of Israel. And so again, we have these two forms of a reading of the Bible that are very destructive. And I think that we need to decline and think about much more closely how we can root out both anti-Semitism and the type of biblical philo-Semitism that is as a root of the Palestinian tragedy. We know that Arthur Balfour, the Foreign Secretary of the British government in 1917, at the time that the Balfour Declaration was published, and his Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, were avid readers of the Bible, and so were proponents of this biblical philo-Semitism, that recognized, supposedly, the Jewish right to a land given to them by God, and thus were completely blinded to the fact that that land is inhabited by a people, the Palestinians, who were supposed to make way for the chosen people of God. Again, I see very closely linked anti-Jewish readings of the Bible to this kind of biblical philo-Semitism that ultimately sees only the Jews and not the Palestinians. And finally, another point that I think is very important. I know that last week you were discussing Islamophobia. And I think that we need to see that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are very much linked together in the development of a hatred and rejection of any kind of difference right through the long centuries of European history. Again, to go back just to one example, the Crusades, the formulation of the Muslim as the enemy outside. We need to conquer Jerusalem, take back the tomb of Christ that has been occupied by the Muslim enemy. But on the way to Jerusalem, the Crusaders wipe out the Jewish communities that they find, seeing the Jews as the enemy from within. Again, this anti-Judaism and this anti-Islam are, in my opinion, coming from the same problematic place of fear, of suspicion, of rejection, of difference that somehow we need to get beyond. Again, our understanding of anti-Semitism needs to be very much associated with our understanding of Islamophobia. And finally, defining anti-Semitism, this has become one of the great battles that are going on in the present age. First of all, why do we need a definition at all? And I think we do need a definition because words are very, very important in order to understand what we are doing as people fighting for justice. But of course, we need to also ask, once we have agreed that we need a definition of anti-Semitism, who is actually defining anti-Semitism? One of the important definitions that is being vehicled today in many, many countries in Europe and North America is a definition formulated by what is known as the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. I've put below a citation from that definition. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Now, I would suggest that there isn't any problem in this definition, but what has been challenged by critics of the IHRA definition is the cases that they give where this actually happens. And of course, the most challenged of all is what to do when there is a criticism of Zionism, a criticism of the state of Israel or its government or its army. How do we understand what it means to fight anti-Semitism? And how do we understand what it means to defend the politics, or even, I will say, the existence of a modern nation state, and in our case, the state of Israel? How do we find distinctions among anti-Semitism, what is being defined here as a certain perception of Jews expressed as hatred towards them, anti-Zionism, which is in its purest form a solid critique of Jewish nationalism, and criticism of the state of Israel. As I come towards the end of my presentation, I do want to give one example where I realized how problematic this all is. As a young Jesuit, just beginning my formation, I was sent to Boston. As an Israeli, a citizen of Israel, of Jewish family, I was sent to Boston to begin my Jesuit training and arrived there and was welcomed into a very large Jesuit community in one of our Jesuit universities, Boston College. And one night, sitting around the table with a group of Jesuits, we were discussing what was going on in Palestine. This was the time of the first Intifada, when Yitzhak Rabin was using terrible means to crush the opposition to the occupation. And I was expressing my opinions, which certainly were very critical of the state of Israel, its leadership, its army, and its politics, using constantly the adjective Israel and talking predominantly about the government and the military. I think someone who would have been a perceptive listener would have realized that I myself am very critical of Zionist ideology and would not define myself as a Zionist. But when I finished saying what I had to say to a group of Jesuits who were listening with great interest, one of them turned to me and said, "It is really terrible what those Jews are doing." And I suddenly realized that this was the first time the word Jew had been brought into the conversation. Not sure how things would develop, I looked at him and said, "What do you mean?" And he said to me, "What I mean is the lies those Jews tell about the Germans. I know the Germans. Nothing ever happened to the Jews that was done by the Germans." And of course, my mouth fell open. I am the child and grandchild of people who ran away from the Nazi regime and whose relatives all perished in the death camps. And I said to this very educated Jesuit professor, "Father, I'm a little tired now, but maybe we can talk about this another time." Of course, he never spoke to me again, because after that discussion, he found out that I was who I was, and I had betrayed him. I had betrayed him by speaking critically of the state of Israel, by expressing critical thoughts about Zionism. He thought I was a fellow traveler. And so I will end with a meditation, a thought that the words that we use create the worlds that we live in. And we need to be very careful about the words that we use, that we say what we mean, so that we do not introduce worlds that we reject and don't want to live in. I think all of us who are supporters and friends of Sabeel, all of those working for Sabeel, we are fighting against injustice of any kind. And that means that we are fighting very, very convincing. We are very convinced of the need for the fight against Islamophobia, against anti-Semitism, and of course, all so that we can defend the rights of the Palestinians even better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Father David. I think it's so important for us to be understanding the history and of all these different terminologies and what has happened and is happening today. To quote from one of our listeners, Mariana Harris said, "He is so clear and systematic. I appreciate this so much. Thanks." Omar, did you want to say something? Okay. So we'll take a little break to introduce our action for the day. And then after the action, we'll do a question and answer. So again, if you have any questions, be sure to be putting them in the chat. We'll collect them and ask them after our action time. So we'll put up a slide for the action for today. We'd like to oppose anti-Semitism in our own communities and cities. We have a few suggestions on the slide on how you can create connections between yourself or your organization and the Jewish community around you. And if you have your own ideas, you can also add them to the chat for other people to see. Father David, is there anything you would like to say about our action time today, or what people can be doing to bring awareness to counter anti-Semitism around the world?
Oh, I like very much these activities. I think that they are very helpful. I would go back to a very basic activity that we can do without even going out of our door, and that is really reflect on how we say what we want to say. That touches not only anti-Semitism, but Islamophobia and any other kind of racism that might have crept into our discourse because of the world that we are formed in.
Absolutely, that self-awareness is so important. All right, so thank you so much. We'll give some time for everyone to work on this, to research any synagogues in the area. And everything you need is being shared in the chat. So we'll give you about 5 minutes to figure out what you can do to address anti-Semitism in your own communities. And then we'll come back to do the question and answer. Thank you. All right, thank you everyone. I hope you had some time to take some actions to do some research on how to reach out. We have a few questions here for Father David. We'll just go right in. First, one of the early questions. How do you explain the fact that many Jews in Israel and around the world turned with time against Israel and are against the Zionists? Isn't this a proof that much of the anti-Semitism is not pure anti-Semitism?
I'm not sure that those 2 points are connected. I think that many Jews around the world and many Israelis, I wish they were many, I'm adopting your word many, are beginning to be very, very troubled by what the state of Israel does, how its policies are followed. And I think that some Jews are making the connection between their own experience as people who have been excluded and treated badly with what the state of Israel is doing to Palestinians. So I think that this is something that would wake up intelligent people anywhere. And I think that Israelis and Jews around the world are starting to wake up.
Thank you. Another question. So in the US, Christian Zionism is large and growing. Is it also biblical philo-Semitism? Are they the same?
So I don't want to say they're the same, but I think that Christian Zionism is a form of biblical philo-Semitism, but a very problematic form of biblical philo-Semitism with certain aspects among certain Christian Zionists. Again, I don't like to generalize, but that are also anti-Jewish. And what do I mean by that? I think that there are some Christian Zionists who believe that by supporting Jews to live in Israel, they will be creating a Jewish society in which finally the Jews will be able to throw off their blinkers and see that Jesus is the Messiah. So that their Christian Zionism is another expression of anti-Judaism, the refusal to recognize Jews as Jewish and the desire to make them Christian. Again, I don't want to say that all Christian Zionists think like that. I also want to point out that even among Christian Zionists, there is the beginnings of a realization that there are Palestinians, and for many of them, the entry into understanding who the Palestinians are through Christian Palestinians. And so I think that also among Christian Zionists, there are those who are disillusioned with the rude ideology that completely ignored the reality of the Palestinian people. So there again, I think that there are some lights out there that show that even among Christian Zionists, there is an awakening to the injustice of 1948 and 1967.
Thank you. We have a more technical question here. It says, although I realize that David's words filled out the meaning of his slideshow, is it possible for him to share the slideshow itself so that we can refer to it later?
Absolutely no problem, Sarah. I can send it to you or to Omar, whoever needs it in order to
that would be great. Thank you. All right, so another question. Could you give us some concrete suggestions about how to challenge the idea that Jews are the, capitalized, chosen people of God and that the land belongs to them? I've heard someone refer to other places as a land of promise, and that seems a small beginning.
Okay, I'm not sure that that is a very fruitful way to go. I'll maybe give some anecdotal illustration of what is going on in Israel among Jews who are very troubled by the use of chosen. One of the prayers that is recited on Friday night, very central prayer at home, refers to, we are the chosen people of God. And Jews who are troubled by that now start to refer to all peoples as chosen, and some kind of attempt to universalize the sense of chosen. I think that, again, this kind of theological language needs to be separated very, very firmly from the political practice of occupation and discrimination. So that I think that if anyone calls themselves chosen, they need to be chosen only in as far as they desire to be in the image and likeness of a God who loves everybody. And so again, I'm not sure. In fact, we did engage. I see that Jan from Holland is here with us. We did engage in a kind of study that took us to those places. And I think that there are many Christians who are progressive, who are ready to give up the concept of election, recognizing its horrible impact on world history. But to convince Jews that they are not chosen might be, again, something that would not lead to dialogue, but rather to polemic. So that my approach would be much more to say, if you are chosen, then please go back to look at the word of God addressed to you and see what that means, so that you become a people that cannot in any way support occupation, cannot in any way support discrimination, and makes you more a light to the nations. So again, I recognize the problematics of Chosen. I'm just not sure if it's a good strategy to walk into a synagogue and tell Jews that, you need to give up the concept of Chosen.
Thank you, Father David. Yeah, I see almost Chosen as being at a higher responsibility, rather than, yeah. Okay, we have 2 more questions, if you don't mind staying a few minutes extra. I think that would be great.
Sure.
A few years ago, I did reach out to the local Orthodox synagogue to ask for a visit and interview for a research paper I was writing. I received no response. When I walk past their synagogue on my way to church, I see the surveillance cameras and sometimes security guards, and I understand how fearful they are, and I feel very sad. I don't know how to reach out to them. I think that they would be very suspicious of my motives. What do you suggest?
I'm not really sure how to answer that, because again, I think that we are torn between a recognition of the reality of anti-Semitism and their desire to reach out so that we can build a strong alliance to fight against injustice. So that I would say that once your local synagogue does not respond, look for Jewish organizations that do respond. I think that we all realize that on the same side as we are in our struggle for justice for Palestine and for the Palestinians, we have Jewish collaborators. We have Jews who are standing with us. And among the strongest critics of Zionism and Israeli politics are Jews who are thinking these things through in ways that can help us think these things through. So again, we cannot force ourselves on Jews who are very concerned with their own security, because we recognize that there's some level of reality to that. But I think that there are Jews out there who really do want to engage us so that we can walk this way together.
Thank you. All right, last question is looking at a very specific issue. And then there was actually a comment that was also put in the chat responding to the question that I'll read as well. And then you can respond kind of as you wish. So it says, could Father David comment on the labeling of Sally Rooney as anti-Semitic because she refused to have her latest book translated into Hebrew, giving the oppression of the Palestinians by the state of Israel? And then there was added by Leslie O'Connor, Sally refused to have her book published by Moden, who published her first 2 novels due to her objection to Moden's support of occupation. She said she would be happy and proud to have her book published in Hebrew. So I don't know, do you know anything about that situation that you would like to comment?
Well, I'd like to comment on the arguments because, Jesuits always have something to say about everything, even if they don't even understand the question. My not understanding the question is that I'm not quite sure who Sally Rooney is. But to look at the arguments, one, saying that she does not want to have anything to do with the occupation. And I would also say it would be completely justified to also say, I don't want to have anything to do with the discrimination against Palestinian Arabs who are citizens of Israel. That is absolutely not anti-Semitic. It doesn't mean to say that an anti-Semite might not share those opinions, but those opinions in themselves have nothing anti-Semitic about them. And this is, of course, the whole struggle with defining anti-Semitism. The moment that the word Israel or Zionism comes into the definition, it becomes very problematic, not to say that any use of Israel or any use of Zionism is okay. There are uses of Israel and uses of Zionism that might indeed be anti-Semitic. But in the situation that you just described, an author who does not want to collaborate with a publishing house that has a stand in favor of occupation and discrimination, I take my hat off to her. If she says that she'd be more than happy to have her book translated into Hebrew, but the translation that was proposed would make her a collaborator with occupation and discrimination, I say, again, my hat off to her. So these are complex issues. And I think that most of the time, one can start listening closely to what people are saying. One can start to realize what is behind what people are saying. And that's why I think it's so important to think carefully about our words.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Father David, for joining us today, sharing your time and your knowledge and insights. I think we've all learned something and to take with us. I want to let everyone know there will be a link to the video of this gathering, as well as the other links shared today, posted on the Kumi Now website and on YouTube in a day or two, and will be shared in our next newsletter. So it would be great if you could share this with others. Perhaps you know other people who would really benefit from hearing this information, and to invite them to join our future sessions. Next week, we'll focus on children's rights. And if you'd like to be reminded of the online gatherings an hour before they begin, you can register for email reminders at kuminow.com/online. Using the form at the bottom of the page. So thank you again so much for joining us, and we hope to see you all here next week.